In the relentless chill of a Seattle winter, a young girl stood at the edge of traffic, a sick infant bundled in her arms, and a box of chocolates held out with a trembling hand. "Chocolate, $1. My little brother is very sick. Please, miss," she pleaded, her voice a fragile thread against the roar of the city. As hope dwindled with each passing car, a solitary man finally paused. His act of compassion was about to alter their destinies forever. The air over Puget Sound had a particular bite that morning. It was sharp, damp, and unforgiving. A persistent drizzle clung to the windshield of Julian Croft's Obsidian sedan as he parked along a curb slick with rain near Pioneer Square. The city was still stirring. The windows of closed cafes cast a warm, hazy glow onto the wet pavement, and the distant Olympic Mountains were shrouded in a thick blanket of gray clouds. Julian stepped out, his breath a plume of white in the cold, and Baron, his Bernese mountain dog, hopped down after him, his paws landing softly on the glistening sidewalk. The leash remained in his pocket. Baron never wandered. This was his morning routine. A quiet walk through the slumbering historic district. It wasn't the fresh air he sought, but the stillness, the illusion that the world had slowed just enough for him to find his footing. 2 years ago, this same kind of damp chill had seeped through the windows of the hospital where his wife had slipped away, taking their unborn daughter with her. In the time since, silence had become his closest confidant and solitude his most ingrained habit. He designed software that managed global logistics, orchestrated teams that optimized supply chains, yet nothing in his arsenal could organize the chaotic grief that had taken root in his life. As they rounded the corner of First and Yesler, Julian's eyes were drawn to a small parquet across the street. A gust of wind, funneled between the old brick buildings, set a lone swing into a slow, aimless motion. His heart gave a familiar, quiet ache. That swing had been motionless for weeks, but now it moved, as if an invisible child had only just leapt from it. He stopped walking, his gaze fixed on its rhythmic sway. Baron paused at his side, his tail giving a gentle swish, sensing the subtle shift in his owner's breathing. Then he heard it. A small, reedy voice, utterly out of place in the pre-dawn quiet. "Chocolate for $1, please, sir. My baby brother is really sick." Julian's head snapped toward the sound. A little girl, no older than 7, was weaving between the idling cars at the crosswalk. Her sneakers were soaked through, and she clutched a small box of chocolates in one hand while cradling a bundled infant in the other. Her cheeks were chapped raw by the cold, her nose a bright pink, her lips pale and cracked. The baby, wrapped in a thin, worn blanket, let out a ragged cough, a sound so faint it was nearly swallowed by the hum of a nearby bus. The girl moved from one car window to the next as they waited for the light. Drivers stared straight ahead. Power windows remained shut. One woman offered a slight shake of her head without ever meeting the child's eyes. The girl didn't weep or beg. She simply moved to the next car with a mechanical sort of resolve. "Sir, it's just $1. My brother needs medicine." Julian stood frozen. The street was only a few yards away, but it felt like an impassable chasm. The wind sliced between the buildings, whipping raindrops into a frenzy around the girl's tattered coat. Then, her foot slipped on a slick metal grate. She staggered, the baby in her arms lurching violently to one side. For a terrifying instant, it looked as though they would both go down into the street. Julian's body reacted before his mind could process the thought. A surge of icy adrenaline shot up his spine, panic igniting in his chest like a flash fire. He broke into a sprint, his dress shoes skidding on the wet pavement, his heart hammering against his ribs. It wasn't the calculated response of a man accustomed to control, but the raw, primal urgency of someone on the verge of losing something irreplaceable. He reached her just as her balance gave way completely. One arm shot out to catch the box of chocolates as it tumbled from her grasp. His other arm wrapped firmly around her back, steadying her and the infant. Up close, he could see the profound thinness of her frame. Her coat was a flimsy thing, barely suitable for autumn, let alone a Pacific Northwest January. Her bare fingers were trembling as they clutched the baby. The girl looked up at him, her eyes wide with alarm. They were a startling shade of stormy gray, far too old for such a small face. "I'm sorry," she said in a rush. "I didn't mean to fall. I'm sorry." Julian shook his head, his own breath coming in ragged bursts. "Are you all right?" She nodded but remained silent, her attention immediately returning to the baby, who had begun to wheeze. It was a wet, shallow, and sickening sound that made the hairs on Julian's neck stand on end. "What's his name?" Julian asked, his voice softer now. "Leo," she answered. "He's one. He has a fever. A really bad one." "How long has he been sick?" "Since yesterday," she said. "Maybe longer. Mom says it's just a cold, but his coughing won't stop and he feels so hot." The traffic light turned green. Cars began to creep forward. A horn blared, and a driver swerved around them with an annoyed glare. Julian guided her back onto the curb, instinctively shielding her from the flow of traffic. "Where's your mom now?" he asked. "Home," she said, a flicker of hesitation in her eyes. "She's sick, too. She couldn't come with me." He looked at the baby again. Leo's face was flushed a deep, unhealthy red, his lips chapped and almost gray. His breaths were coming in short, rapid bursts, each one followed by a distinct rattling in his small chest. The baby coughed again, a harsh, spasming hack that shook his entire tiny body. The girl looked up at Julian, her composure finally shattering. Her voice broke with desperation. "Please, he can't breathe." In that moment, Julian felt something inside him fracture. It wasn't pity or a sense of charity. It was something more ancient, more visceral. It was the memory of utter helplessness. A scream echoing down a sterile hospital hallway, a swing moving aimlessly in the wind. And now, a child on the brink of collapse, asking him to do the one thing no one else had. "Come with me," he said, his voice firmer than he felt. As a fresh wave of rain began to fall, soft and silent, Julian reached for her small, cold hand and held on tight. The heater inside the luxury sedan blasted warm air, fogging the windows within minutes. Julian angled the vents toward the back seat, where the girl, Maya, as she'd later told him her name was, sat stiffly, cradling Leo in her lap. Baron, ever the gentle giant, had hopped into the passenger seat, but immediately turned to face them. He rested his heavy chin on Maya's knee, a silent, furry guardian who seemed to grasp the gravity of the situation. Maya didn't pull away. Instead, her trembling fingers found their way to the thick fur between Baron's ears, stroking him with an instinctual rhythm. Her face was still ashen, but a fraction of the tension in her shoulders seemed to dissolve, as if her body recognized kindness, even if her mind was still catching up. Julian saw it. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Leo let out another cough, this one deeper and more ragged, followed by a weak whimper that was barely audible over the hum of the engine. Julian glanced in the rearview mirror. The baby's cheeks were a mottled, angry red, and his chest rose and fell with a shallow, labored motion. Julian's hands tightened on the steering wheel. His gut screamed at him to drive, but his mind, conditioned for calculation and strategy, held him for a moment. He glanced at his watch. 9:47 a.m. He was late. The Singapore call had been scheduled for 9:30 sharp, a pivotal investor pitch with a major international partner. 6 months of painstaking negotiations, all culminating in this one meeting. His assistant Clara would be in a full-blown panic. The company's trajectory could genuinely shift based on his presence on that call. But behind him sat Maya, holding a sick child wrapped in a threadbare blanket and a shred of hope. "I can wait here," she said softly, her voice small. She had read the hesitation in his posture with an acuity born of disappointment. "If you have to go, we'll just wait." Julian turned around slowly to face her. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. He reached into the center console and retrieved his phone. 5 missed calls, a dozen texts. His thumb hovered over the screen before he opened a voice memo app, pressed record, and spoke into the device. "Clara, cancel Singapore. Family emergency. Reschedule for next week. Make it happen." He hit send and tossed the phone into the cup holder without a second glance. Outside, the rain streaked down the glass. Inside, the silence was thick, but it was a living silence, pulsing with the weight of the decision he'd just made. "You're not from around here, are you?" Maya asked quietly. Julian met her gaze in the mirror. "I live up on the lake, past Madison Park." "Is that where the big glass house is? On the point?" He nodded. "I saw it once from the bus," she said. "Looks like a castle." Julian let out a short breath, not quite a laugh. "It's too quiet for a castle." She hugged Leo a little closer. "Quiet can be good." "Not always," Julian replied. There was a brief pause. "Our heater broke 2 nights ago," Maya offered suddenly, as if explaining everything. "Mom tried to fix it, but then she got sick. We were going to go to the shelter, but they said there was no room for families." Julian's jaw clenched. He said nothing. "I tried to get help yesterday," she continued. "I knocked on the back door of a bakery, but the lady said she was too busy. She said she'd call someone, but nobody ever came." Of course nobody came, Julian thought with a surge of bitterness. The systems weren't designed for moments like this. They were for forms, procedures, and rules that had long forgotten the people they were meant to serve. Leo let out a sharp, gasping cough, a sound that made both of them flinch. His tiny hands were limp, his head now lolling more heavily against his sister's arm. "He's getting hotter," she whispered. Julian didn't hesitate this time. He put the car in gear. "We're going to the hospital," he said, his voice low and resolute. Maya's head shot up. "But we don't have insurance." "I do," he said firmly. "You're not paying for anything." Silence again, and then a faint whisper. "Thank you." Julian merged into the downtown traffic, his eyes fixed on the road ahead, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. In the rearview mirror, Maya was rocking her brother gently, whispering soft reassurances he couldn't quite hear. Barron had turned completely around now, resting his head against the seat to watch over the baby. "Where's your mom now?" Julian asked again, his voice softer this time. "At the storage unit, behind the old cannery in Soto. She couldn't walk this morning. She told me I had to go alone. She said to be careful crossing the street." "And you've been out there since sunrise?" "I sold 2 chocolate bars." Julian swallowed, a hard lump forming in his throat. Maya added, "If I sold 3 more, I was going to buy some fever medicine from the drugstore, the cheap kind. I don't know if it would have helped, but it was all we could afford." Julian's hands flexed on the wheel. "What's your mom's name?" "Sarah," Maya said. "Sarah Carter." He committed the name to memory, filing it away as if it were more important than any contract he'd ever signed. Leo coughed again, a long, low rattle like stones in a jar. Julian pressed his foot harder on the accelerator. He wasn't sure when the shift had occurred. Maybe it was the sight of the empty swing. Maybe it was the second Maya hadn't flinched from Barron's touch. Or maybe it was when she had looked him in the eye and said with quiet dignity, "We'll wait." But something fundamental had changed. This was no longer a detour. This was a new direction. It was something that couldn't be quantified in a quarterly report or a 5-year plan. And whatever it was, he knew he couldn't walk away from it now. The red emergency sign of Harborview Medical Center came into view through the rain-streaked windshield just as Leo's breath hitched again. And then, for one terrifying second, stopped. Julian laid on the horn and swerved toward the ER entrance, his voice a raw command. "Hold on, buddy. Just hold on." The emergency room doors slid open with a pneumatic hiss as Julian rushed through, Maya at his heels, her arms wrapped tightly around Leo's feverish body. The fluorescent lights overhead cast a sterile, unforgiving glare on the intake area. The air smelled of antiseptic and a quiet, pervasive dread, the kind of scent that clings to your clothes long after you've left. A nurse at the triage desk looked up, her expression shifting from boredom to alarm at the sight of Julian's urgency. "We need a doctor now," he said, his voice sharp with a tightly controlled panic. "The baby, he's not breathing right." Maya stood rigidly beside him, her gaze locked on the nurse, her small jaw set with the same unnatural composure Julian had seen on the street. She hadn't shed a single tear. She just stood there, clutching her brother, as if her embrace alone could anchor him to this world. Another nurse appeared, younger, with compassionate eyes and efficient hands. "This way," she said, waving them through a set of secured double doors. "Are you the father?" she asked, as she led them into a small examination room, already reaching for a pulse oximeter and a thermometer. The question struck him with unexpected force, a beat of silence. "Yes," he said. Maya's eyes flickered toward him for a fraction of a second, but she said nothing. The nurse didn't question it. She just nodded, visibly relieved that someone was taking charge. They laid Leo on a narrow gurney. His tiny chest fluttered with rapid, shallow breaths, his skin flushed and blotchy. The nurse quickly fitted a pediatric oxygen mask over his face. "We need to get his vitals stabilized," she said gently. "He's running a dangerously high fever, 104.8. Julian stood beside Maya as a third nurse came in to get her information. She answered every question with a steady voice, never taking her eyes off her brother. "Do you have medical insurance?" "No," Maya replied. "Any known allergies?" "Not that I know of." "Father's name?" the nurse prompted. Maya hesitated, her mouth opening and closing without a sound. Julian stepped forward. "It's just her, the baby, and their mother," he said quietly. "She's very ill as well, barely able to move." The nurse nodded again, her expression softening. "We'll do everything we can. You got him here just in time." Those words echoed in Julian's mind, just in time. If he had taken a different route that morning, if he hadn't paused at that swing, if he had tuned out that tiny voice in the din of traffic, the thought made his hands tremble. The doors swung shut as the nurses wheeled Leo away toward the pediatric wing. Julian turned to Maya, who was still standing frozen, her arms now limp and empty at her sides. "Come on," he said softly. "Let's go sit down." She followed him wordlessly to the waiting area, a sea of hard plastic chairs, flickering news channels on wall-mounted televisions, and people slumped over with the weary patience of the worried and the injured. Barron, who had waited dutifully outside the main entrance, was allowed in by a sympathetic security guard and now curled at Maya's feet with a low, concerned whine. Julian sat beside her, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. He could feel her shivering next to him, a tremor that came not just from the cold, but from the abrupt silence that follows a surge of fear. He glanced over at her. "Are you warm enough?" She nodded. After a moment, she whispered, "He's really sick, isn't he?" Julian didn't lie. "Yes, but he's in the best place for him now." Another pause. Then she said, "We sleep in a storage unit. Behind the old cannery. The roof leaks when it rains. It gets so cold. He swallowed hard. How long have you been there? 3 months, since we couldn't pay the rent anymore. Mom said it would only be for a week or two, but then she got sick, and I couldn't leave Leo by himself. You've been taking care of them both? She nodded again, her eyes still fixed on the closed doors down the hallway. Sometimes I trade the chocolates for food. Sometimes people give me leftovers. Most of the time, they just look away. Julian didn't know what to say. He wasn't accustomed to this kind of powerlessness. Not anymore. But he was beginning to remember it. A memory surfaced from 2 years ago. Him, sitting in a different waiting room, staring at the polished floor while a team of doctors tried to stop a hemorrhage no one had seen coming. The nurse had called him Dad then, too. And even though he wasn't, not yet, the word had felt like a crushing weight. That day, no one he loved had made it back through those doors. He looked at Maya, her small body curled into itself, and something inside his chest solidified. You're not alone anymore, okay? He said, his voice quiet but firm. She didn't reply, but she leaned a little closer to Baron, who shifted to rest his warm head on her lap. Her hand found his fur again, her thumb beginning to move back and forth in a small, steady, soothing motion, as if she were comforting him as much as herself. A nurse returned 15 minutes later. You can come in now, she said. Your brother is stable. We have him on IV fluids and fever medication. He's sleeping. Maya shot to her feet. Can I see him? The nurse smiled gently. Of course. One at a time. She looked at Julian. You can come too, Mr. Croft. Julian blinked. How did you... Reception saw your card when you covered the emergency intake. And thank you. Most people walk out the door when they hear there's no insurance. He didn't respond, just followed Maya down the hall. The pediatric room was small, filled with the soft beeps of monitors. Leo lay in a crib in the center, swaddled in warm blankets, his small face finally calm, the oxygen mask still in place. Maya approached slowly, her steps tentative. She stood on her tiptoes to peer over the railing. He looks better, she whispered. Julian stood a few feet behind her, hands in his coat pockets, watching the scene. A nurse checked Leo's vitals and offered a warm blanket to Maya, who sat in a chair beside the crib, wrapped in fleece, silent. Then she turned to Julian. Thank you for not leaving, she said, her voice barely audible. Most people do. Julian's own voice felt thick in his throat. I'm not most people? Behind them, another nurse entered with a clipboard. The mother, Sarah Carter, is that right? We just got a call from the paramedics. They're bringing her in. She's unresponsive. Oxygen levels are dropping. Maya turned sharply toward Julian, her lip trembling for the very first time. We have to help her. Please don't let her die, too. Julian didn't hesitate. He handed Baron's leash to the nurse at the door. Stay, he told the dog softly. Baron whined, but sat obediently, as Julian followed the second nurse through the brightly lit corridors, Maya trotting beside him, the blanket slipping from her shoulders, her eyes wide with a new wave of fear. The world became a blur of blinding white hallways, murmured codes over an intercom, and the relentless, echoing pound of Julian's shoes on the linoleum. Where is she? He demanded. Just arriving, the nurse replied. They found her behind the old cannery. Severe pneumonia, possible sepsis. Her breathing is shallow, temperature is dangerously high. Julian's jaw tightened. Behind him, Maya's voice trembled. What's sepsis? It's an infection that spreads through the body, Julian explained gently, glancing down at her. It's serious, but she's in the right place now. They rounded a corner and saw her. Sarah Carter lay unconscious on a stretcher, her hair matted with sweat, her lips tinged with blue, a nasal cannula already in place. Her face was gaunt, her skin unnervingly pale. She looked nothing like the woman Maya had described, the one who was smart and funny and always made pancakes when they had flour. For a moment, Julian just stood there as a team of nurses and doctors swarmed around her, inserting an IV line, connecting monitors, prepping antibiotics. She didn't even know we were gone, Maya whispered, tears finally spilling down her cheeks. I left her a note. I told her I'd be careful. She always tells me to be careful. Julian placed a steadying hand on her small shoulder. You did the right thing, Maya. You brought help. A doctor looked up from the stretcher. Honestly, another day. She might not have made it. You made the difference. The words hung in the sterile air, heavy with unspoken possibilities. After Sarah was stabilized and admitted, the hospital administrator pulled Julian aside. She's going to need extensive care, the doctor said, glancing toward Maya, who was curled up with Baron in a corner of the hallway. A few days of intensive antibiotics, fluids, oxygen. She's in very poor condition, but she's young. I'll cover everything, Julian said without a moment's hesitation. A private room, the best care you can provide. The doctor raised an eyebrow. Are you sure, sir? This could be... She has 2 children who need her, Julian cut in. That's all the reason I need. Later that evening, as Sarah rested under sedation, Julian stepped outside for a breath of air. The cold was a shock, but not an unwelcome one. The rain had stopped and the sky had cleared, revealing a canopy of stars, sharp and infinite above the city lights. He leaned against his car and dialed his assistant. Clara, he said, not waiting for a greeting. Cancel everything for the rest of the week. Singapore, Tokyo, whatever is on the calendar. You're already off the Singapore call. I managed to move it, but sir, are you all right? I'm fine, he said, his voice softening. I'm just where I need to be. There was a pause on the other end. Then, her voice professional but warm. All right, Julian, I'll handle it. He hung up and stared at the sky for a long moment before heading back inside. When he returned to the pediatric floor, Maya had fallen asleep in a chair, her head resting on Baron's side, a hospital blanket draped over her. Leo was sleeping peacefully in his crib nearby, his breathing even and calm. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, Julian felt something settle in his chest. It wasn't peace, not yet, but it was purpose. He had slipped out earlier to a nearby 24-hour market and bought everything he could think of: diapers, formula, warm socks, and a soft fleece hat for Maya. He set the bags down quietly and took a seat, watching the soft rise and fall of Maya's chest, the steady rhythm of Leo's monitors, the way Baron's tail twitched in his sleep. The clock on the wall ticked past midnight. None of this was part of his meticulously organized life plan. But when Maya stirred and blinked her eyes open, she didn't look surprised to find him there. You stayed? She murmured. I told you I would. She sat up, her fingers instinctively finding Baron's ears. She looked toward the hallway leading to the adult wing. Mom? She's resting. The doctors say she's strong. Maya exhaled a long, shaky breath, as if she'd been holding it for days. I brought some things, Julian said, and some soup. It's still warm. He offered her a paper cup. She held it in both hands and took a small, cautious sip. Her eyes fluttered closed for a second. It tastes like home, she whispered. He didn't ask her what that meant. He just sat with her as her tiny fingers warmed around the cup. When she was finished, he helped her settle into the small cot a nurse had brought in. He gently pulled the covers up to her chin. Try to get some sleep, kiddo. You've done more than enough for one day. She turned her head on the pillow, her eyes already heavy. Do you think she'll smile again? She whispered, like she used to. Julian swallowed the lump in his throat and brushed a strand of hair from her forehead. I think she will, he said softly, and I think you'll be the reason why. As Julian stepped back out into the quiet hallway, his phone buzzed. A new notification glowed on the screen, an urgent alert from his board of directors. The Singaporean firm was threatening to walk away from the deal entirely. He stared at the message, then looked back toward the sleeping girl in the room. And for the first time in his professional life, he didn't care. The next morning, Julian woke earlier than he had in years, and not in his own bed. He had taken a room at a small hotel near the hospital, a modest place with a firm mattress and drafty windows. It wasn't comfort that had woken him, but something else, a pull, a sense of responsibility, a quiet promise made to two children whose names were now more deeply ingrained in his mind than any corporate ledger. By 6:30 a.m., he was back at the hospital, carrying two paper bags. One held fresh clothes for Maya, socks, leggings, and a cozy sweatshirt he hoped would fit. The other contained a warm croissant and a carton of orange juice. The hospital corridors were still hushed, lit by the soft morning light filtering through the large windows. Maya was awake, curled up on the cot with Baron still faithfully beside her. She sat up the moment she saw Julian enter. "You came back." He offered a faint smile. "I told you I would." Leo was still asleep in his crib nearby, breathing steadily, his fever finally broken. Maya took the croissant with both hands, whispering a quiet "thank you" before taking a large bite. Julian sat in the chair across from her, watching her eat as if she hadn't had a warm meal in days, which he realized was likely the truth. "Do you like school?" asked gently, breaking the comfortable silence. Maya shrugged. "I haven't been in a while. Not since Mom got really sick. I was scared they'd take Leo away if I told anyone." Julian nodded slowly, a deep ache spreading through his chest. "You did what you had to do to protect him." "I tried to read to him, though," she added, a small, faint smile touching her lips. "Mom kept an old picture book from when I was a baby. He likes the pages with the animals." Julian looked over at Leo, still curled beneath his blanket, and then back at Maya, her thin arms wrapped around her knees while Baron pressed against her side. Something about the scene, simple, quiet, and raw, seemed to rearrange the very rhythm of his heart. He didn't go to his office that day or the next. He became a fixture at the hospital. Each morning he arrived with fresh food, a soft scarf for Maya's neck, socks that fit perfectly, and a small, stuffed bear with a stitched heart for Leo. The nurses started to recognize him. One asked if he was a relative. Another simply smiled and said, "It's nice to see someone stay." Julian didn't know how to explain his presence, even to himself. All he knew was that he needed to be there, not out of obligation, but because something inside him thawed every time he saw Maya's face light up, when Baron trotted in, or when she whispered stories to Leo about sunny days at the park. At night, Julian would return to his vast, modern house on Lake Washington, but it no longer felt the same. The silence wasn't peaceful anymore. It was hollow. The sterile scent of glass and steel made him restless. The house no longer felt like a sanctuary of success. It felt like an empty vessel, waiting for something to fill it. Days turned into a week, and the rhythms of care slowly replaced the rhythms of business. He still answered urgent emails and approved major decisions from his phone, but his mornings were now dedicated to Maya and Leo. He learned that Maya loved puzzles and strawberry jam, that she hummed softly when she brushed Baron's fur, and that she hated asking for help, but always said thank you when it was given. Leo's cheeks regained their color. He smiled more and coughed less. One afternoon, while Julian was holding him, he let out a laugh, a full, bubbling baby laugh that filled the sterile room with such unadulterated joy that Julian had to look away for a moment to compose himself. The next day, Leo was discharged from pediatric observation. He no longer needed constant monitoring, but Sarah still hadn't woken up. "She's stable," the doctor assured him. "She just needs rest, antibiotics, and time." Julian had already arranged for a private room for her, covering all the expenses quietly, without mentioning it to Maya. One evening, as they sat watching Leo sleep, Maya looked up at him. "Do you think my mom will know us when she wakes up?" "She'll know you," Julian said softly. "She'll always know you." Maya nodded, then hesitated. "Do you think she'll like you?" Julian smiled gently. "I hope so." Maya reached into her new backpack, a blue one Julian had brought, which she'd already started decorating with stickers, and pulled out a drawing. It was a picture of her, Leo, and Baron. But standing next to them was a taller figure with brown hair, a blue jacket, and a small, tentative smile. "This is you," she said. "I didn't know what kind of shoes you wear, so I just gave you big boots." He looked at the drawing, then at her, his throat tightening. "They look perfect to me," he said. That night, as Julian stood at a window in the hospital hallway, looking out over the glittering city, his phone buzzed again. It was Clara. The Singaporean firm had issued a final notice. The deal would collapse entirely if he didn't fly out by morning. He switched the screen off without reading the rest of the message. Behind him, Maya's voice floated softly through the cracked door of the room. "He stayed, Baron," she whispered to the dog. "He always stays." The hallway outside room 207 was unnervingly quiet that morning, the silence punctuated only by the faint, rhythmic beeping of monitors and the occasional squeak of a nurse's shoes on the polished floor. Julian stood there, his hands shoved deep in his coat pockets, rocking slightly on the balls of his feet. It had been nearly an hour since the nurse had informed him that Sarah Carter was showing signs of waking up, an hour that had stretched into an eternity. He wasn't used to this kind of waiting. Not here, not like this. In a boardroom, he could command $1 billion negotiation with a few carefully chosen words and an unwavering posture. But here, waiting outside the room of a woman regaining consciousness, he felt utterly exposed, like a man standing barefoot in a storm, uncertain of his footing and afraid to move. Down in the pediatric wing, Maya was reading to Leo from one of the picture books Julian had brought last week. Her small, clear voice carried down the corridor in gentle waves, punctuated by an occasional giggle from Leo that sounded like music. Julian had stepped out to give them a moment, but now he lingered like a shadow, unsure of where he belonged in this unfolding chapter. He rubbed his hands together, a gesture born of nerves rather than cold. Would Sarah be grateful, suspicious, angry? He had entered her life in the midst of its greatest chaos, a stranger who had made decisions on her behalf, paid her medical bills, and brought her children clean clothes and warm meals. Every action had been intended as help, but he knew that help, unasked for, could sometimes feel like an intrusion. "Mr. Croft?" a nurse said gently, stepping out of room 207. He turned. "She's awake." He nodded, his throat tight, and followed her into the room. The sight of Sarah sitting upright, propped against a mound of pillows, took him by surprise. She was still pale, her frame fragile beneath the thin hospital gown, but her eyes were open, alert, and searching. Her dark, curly hair was matted against her forehead, and an oxygen tube rested beneath her nose, but she looked undeniably alive. When her gaze met his, she didn't flinch. "You must be the one Maya keeps talking about," she said, her voice raspy but steady. Julian stepped closer to the bed. Julian Croft. I figured. She offered a faint, crooked smile. Most people don't show up with a Bernese mountain dog and a thermos of soup. Julian let out a small chuckle, some of the tension in his shoulders easing. Baron's the real star. I'm just his driver. Sarah's gaze drifted toward the small window, where the gray Seattle sky was beginning to show hints of blue. Maya? Is she okay? She's better than okay, he said. She's been sleeping here most nights, reading to Leo, watching over both of you like a little general. Sarah nodded slowly, a single tear escaping and tracing a path down her cheek. That girl. She's always tried to be older than she is. Julian hesitated for a moment, then moved a bit closer. She told me. She said you hadn't eaten in days, that you collapsed right after she left. I begged her not to go alone, Sarah whispered, but I couldn't even sit up anymore. A thick, heavy silence settled between them, but it wasn't hostile. Finally, Sarah looked him directly in the eye. Why? Julian blinked. Why what? Why are you here? Why did you stop for her that day? You could have kept walking. Everyone else did. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he walked to the side of the room and leaned against the window ledge, letting out a long, slow breath. Because I saw myself in her, he said, his voice quiet. Not literally, but the day I lost my wife, I stood in a hospital just like this one, feeling completely helpless, completely alone, watching someone I loved slip away right in front of me. Sarah's expression softened. I couldn't do anything to stop it then, he continued. I've spent the last 2 years trying to fill that emptiness with work, with structure, with building walls so high no one could ever get through. He paused. Then I saw your daughter in the middle of traffic, holding her baby brother and asking strangers for help. And something inside me just broke. His voice grew quieter. I didn't stop because I wanted to feel noble. I stopped because I couldn't stand the thought of walking away again. A long moment passed. Then Sarah reached out a hand. The gesture was small, barely a shift of her thin arm, but it landed with the force of a thunderclap in Julian's chest. He stepped forward, and her hand found his. It felt fragile, but it was warm. I don't know the full extent of what you've done for us, she said, but I know my children are safe, and I know you didn't have to be here. But you are. Julian felt a familiar tightening behind his eyes, an emotion he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a very long time. Maya told me she drew you into our family, Sarah added, a wry smile touching her lips. She did. She's usually right about people. There was another long silence, but this one wasn't heavy. It felt like something gentle and important settling into place. I'm not trying to replace anything, Julian said, his voice earnest. I'm just here. For as long as you'll let me be. Sarah gave his hand a slight squeeze. We could use someone who stays. Later that evening, the moment a nurse gave the all-clear, Maya rushed into her mother's room. Leo followed in Julian's arms, clutching his bottle and wearing a bright yellow fleece hat. Mommy! Maya cried, skidding to a halt at the side of the bed. Sarah opened her arms weakly. Hey, sunshine! Maya scrambled up beside her, tucking herself under her mother's arm as if no time had passed at all. Julian gently sat Leo on the bed, and he wiggled his way over to curl up next to them. Sarah looked up at Julian, her eyes shining. You too, she said softly. So he sat on the edge of the bed, while Baron settled on the floor below. And for the first time in 2 long years, Julian felt it. Not just hope, not just purpose, but a profound sense of belonging. As the children drifted to sleep, nestled beside their mother, Sarah looked at Julian and whispered, "So, what happens next?" Julian glanced down at the drawing Maya had left folded on the bedside table, the one that now included him. "Whatever you want," he said quietly. "But I've already made some space." 2 weeks later, the air in Seattle had softened. The relentless rain had given way to periods of bright sun, and the cherry blossoms were beginning to show their first hints of pink, promising that spring was not far behind. At the edge of Julian's sprawling property on Lake Washington, the once silent guest house now glowed with life. Sarah stood by the kitchen window of the newly renovated cottage, cradling a warm mug of tea. Color had returned to her cheeks, and though her frame was still slender, she moved with a newfound strength. The antibiotics had worked their magic, but so had the rest. More than any medicine, what had truly healed her was seeing her children safe, warm, and playing on soft rugs instead of cold concrete. Maya sat on the living room floor beside Baron, giggling as she tried to tape a crayon drawing to the freshly painted wall. The paper kept curling at the corners. "Stay," she commanded the page, smoothing it down with both hands. Julian walked in at that moment carrying a small toolbox. He crouched beside her, a twinkle in his eye. "A masterpiece like that deserves a proper frame," he said. Maya grinned up at him. "It's of us, all of us, even Baron." He studied the drawing. There were the familiar stick figures, a tall man in a blue jacket, a mom in a purple dress, a girl with wild curly hair, a baby with big round cheeks, and a large fluffy dog in the middle. "I'll hang it for you," he said, reaching for a small nail and a hammer. "How about right above the fireplace?" "Perfect," she declared. Sarah watched them from the doorway, her heart so full it felt like it might burst. She couldn't remember the last time she'd seen Maya so completely relaxed, so carefree and loud with joy. Her gaze fell on the kitchen counter, where a basket of fresh groceries sat, delivered that morning by one of Julian's staff. She hadn't had to ask, he simply made sure they always had what they needed. The guest house wasn't enormous, but it was warm, sturdy, and thoughtfully furnished. 2 bedrooms, a cozy living area, and a back deck that overlooked the manicured lawn sloping down to the lake. Julian had insisted on adding a small play area just off the deck, complete with a sandbox and a tire swing that would be hung as soon as the ground was fully dry. Later that afternoon, Leo took his first real steps. He toddled across the hardwood floor with a wobbly determination, his arms outstretched for balance. Sarah started to move toward him, but before she could, Leo stumbled slightly and looked not at her, but straight at Julian. Without a second's hesitation, he wobbled the last 2 feet and collapsed into Julian's arms with a triumphant squeal. Sarah blinked back tears. Maya gasped. Julian froze for a second. Then a wide, genuine smile spread across his face as he scooped the baby up. "Did you see that?" Maya shouted, jumping to her feet. "He walked. He really walked." "Looks like I've got some competition," Sarah joked, crossing her arms over her chest to hide the wave of emotion that washed over her. "Better start training for the Toddler Olympics," Julian replied, bouncing Leo gently in his arms. That evening, as the sky turned a soft lavender, a knock came at the door. Julian opened it to find a social worker standing on the porch, a woman named Miss Albright, bundled in a thick coat and holding a clipboard. "Mr. Croft," she greeted, "and Mrs. Carter, I presume." Sarah joined them in the entryway. "Yes, please come in." Ms. Albright looked around the guest house with a professional air, but Julian saw her expression soften as she took in the details. The baby books on the shelf, the scent of the dinner still warm on the stove, the crayon drawings taped proudly to the refrigerator. After the introductions, she sat with them at the dining table, flipping through her paperwork. "We've been reviewing your situation," she said. Given Ms. Carter's recent hospitalization and the children's temporary status in your care, we're here to evaluate the next steps for support. Julian leaned forward. Whatever is needed, I'm here. Financially, logistically, legally. Ms. Albright raised an eyebrow. You are not a relative, Mr. Croft. I know, he said calmly, but I'm not going anywhere. These kids are a part of my life now. So is Sarah. Ms. Albright studied him for a long moment. You understand what that entails? I do. Maya peeked around the corner from the hallway with Baron at her side, listening intently. Julian caught her eye and gave her a small, reassuring nod. Ms. Albright continued. The next phase will require regular check-ins, documentation, and an affidavit of guardianship if permanent custody is pursued. Sarah reached for Julian's hand under the table. He turned his palm up and laced his fingers through hers. We'll handle it, she said, her voice clear and strong. Together. Ms. Albright smiled faintly. I'll make a note of that, for what it's worth. She gestured to the warm, lively home around them. This is one of the best environments I've seen in a very long time. After she left, they stood on the porch together, watching her car's tail lights disappear down the long driveway. A soft breeze rustled through the tall pine trees. Maya came out to stand between them. Was that a good visit? She asked. Julian knelt down to her level. It was. Does it mean we get to stay? He looked at Sarah, then back at Maya. It means we're building something, he said, and you're the heart of it, kiddo. That night, as Maya was getting into bed, she tugged on his sleeve. Will you still be here in the morning? Julian brushed a strand of hair behind her ear. I'm not ever leaving, remember? She smiled sleepily. Good, because you're better than Santa Claus. Sarah laughed softly from the doorway. Julian tucked Maya in, kissed her forehead, and walked back into the living room where Sarah was curled up on the couch. They sat like that for a long time, watching the fire crackle in the hearth, her head resting on his shoulder. You didn't have to do any of this, she whispered. No, he replied. But I couldn't not do it. You're not just a chapter in my story, Sarah. You're the reason I started writing again. It was a crisp spring afternoon, the kind where the sunlight filtered through the newly budded trees, and the last traces of winter had finally surrendered to the warming earth. The sky over Seattle stretched wide and blue as Julian, Sarah, Maya, Leo, and Baron strolled together down the familiar streets of Pioneer Square. The city was humming with its usual energy, but for them, it felt like they were in their own quiet bubble. Leo sat snugly in his stroller, clutching a soft yellow teddy bear. Maya skipped a few steps ahead, her wild hair bouncing with each joyful hop. Sarah walked beside Julian, her arm linked comfortably through his. Baron trotted faithfully at their side, his tail swaying in time with their steps. They weren't headed anywhere in particular. They were simply walking, breathing, existing as something they had not yet named aloud, but had quietly, completely become a family. As they neared the intersection of First and Yesler, Julian slowed his pace. His gaze shifted to the crosswalk where, months ago, he had first seen a little girl with frozen fingers and a threadbare coat, holding a baby in one arm and a box of chocolates in the other. The memory washed over him, not with pain, but with a profound sense of power. The wind had been sharper that day, the air colder, the silence surrounding her deafening. He looked at the spot where she had nearly slipped on the slick metal grate. The same crack in the pavement was still there. Maya noticed him slow down and turned around, squinting in the afternoon sun. "This is where it happened, isn't it?" she asked softly. Julian nodded. "Yeah, right here." She walked back to his side and stood still for a moment, looking around as if trying to see the ghost of her former self in that exact spot. "You almost didn't stop." "No," he admitted, his voice quiet. "But something told me I had to." Sarah reached for his free hand and gently laced her fingers through his. "And you did," she whispered. "You stopped." They all stood there for a few seconds longer, letting the memory settle in the stillness. Leo cooed from his stroller, content. Maya leaned against Julian's side, her small fingers finding his once more. Baron sat obediently at their feet, his golden-brown fur catching the sunlight like a halo. The red hand on the signal changed to a walking figure. Julian looked down at Maya. "What do you say, kiddo?" She beamed, her cheeks flushed with happiness. "Let's go home, Daddy." He smiled, blinking against the sudden warmth that filled his eyes, and nodded. "Let's go." The five of them crossed the street together. No longer a broken girl and a silent CEO. No longer two separate stories intersecting by chance, but a single, woven thread of second chances, redemption, and a love born not from blood, but from choice. Back at the guest house, the day continued with a beautiful ordinariness. Maya colored at the kitchen table, while Sarah prepared a simple pasta dinner. Leo banged a plastic spoon on his high-chair tray, laughing at the noise, while Baron supervised from his usual spot near the fridge. After dinner, Julian went into the main house. He carefully lifted a new photo frame from the box it came in. Inside was a picture taken just last weekend, the four of them sitting on the back deck, Maya holding Leo, Baron in the middle, all of them smiling into the wind. He set the frame on the mantel, right next to an older photo of him and his late wife. He didn't replace the old one. He didn't need to. Instead, he gently dusted its glass, ran a thumb across the edge, and whispered, "You see this, love? We're not alone anymore." Later that night, Maya padded into the living room in her pajamas, holding a folded piece of construction paper. "I made something," she said shyly. Julian took it, unfolding the drawing. It was a picture of a house, their house, with a bright sun in the sky, trees all around, and 5 stick figures. A tall man, a woman with curly hair, a girl in a red dress, a baby with big eyes, and a fluffy dog with a giant heart drawn on its chest. At the top, in bold crayon letters, it read, "Our home." His throat tightened. "Do you like it?" Maya asked, her voice filled with hope. He bent down and scooped her into a hug that felt like it held all the gratitude in the world. "I love it." Sarah joined them in the hallway, watching the two of them with soft, knowing eyes. "Do you think they'll remember all of this?" she asked later when the kids were asleep and the house had gone still. She and Julian sat on the couch shoulder to shoulder, mugs of cocoa in their hands. "I think they'll remember the feeling," he said, "of being safe, of being wanted, of being loved." Sarah leaned her head on his shoulder. "And you? What will you remember?" He looked down at her, his voice full of a quiet wonder. "That I thought my life was over. And then one little girl, standing in the cold, changed everything." She smiled. "Some stories," he continued, "don't begin at the beginning. Some begin the moment you're brave enough to stop." They sat in silence for a long while, listening to the soft creaks of a house that was finally, truly, full of life again. In the bedroom down the hall, Maya slept with the stuffed bear clutched tightly in her arms. Leo snored softly from the crib beside her, and Baron, curled protectively at the foot of her bed, let out a deep, contented sigh and settled in for the night. It wasn't the kind of ending you read about in fairy tales. It was better. It was real. In the darkness, Maya stirred, her voice barely a whisper. "Daddy?" Julian opened her door, already stepping inside. "Yeah, kiddo?" She smiled sleepily. Thanks for seeing us. He knelt beside her bed, kissed her forehead, and whispered back, You saved me first.